Our next two guests are two parliamentarians, one Labour and one Conservative. They'll give us their view on how we reduce the NHS waiting times. Let's talk first to George Foulkes, Baron of Cumnock and a former minister under Tony Blair. Also alongside him, Paul Bristow, the MP for Peterborough, a Conservative. Welcome to the show, both. Let's start with you, Lord Foulkes. The NHS is in crisis across the United Kingdom, but the ambulance crisis is particularly acute in Scotland, with the British Army from tomorrow starting to be driving ambulances. What has led to this mess?
I think the Army is also going to be driving ambulances in other parts of the United Kingdom. But the problem is the lack of funding in the NHS. And this precedes the COVID crisis. Of course, it's been exacerbated by the COVID crisis. But you go back to the many years of austerity under the Tory government. When Tony Blair was Prime Minister, we were spending an extra 7% each year in real terms extra on the NHS. And the NHS was expanding. But under the Tories, there's been this austerity, cutback after cutback. And we've seen fewer doctors, fewer nurses, fewer ambulances because of that. And Boris Johnson talks about, he said the other week, we're going to have 6,000 extra doctors. What he forgets about is that it takes 6 years to train a doctor. And this should have been planned for years and years ago instead of cutting back. The number of doctors has reduced.
I'm afraid that's not, strictly speaking, true, is it? In 2018, Theresa May announced an extra £394 million every week for the NHS. Similarly, another boost to NHS funding has just been announced last month by this government. Billions more have been poured in to the NHS compared to where it was a decade ago.
No, not in real terms, not at all. And if there was, then we wouldn't have this crisis. We'd have more doctors. You can't get face-to-face meetings with a GP now in many places. Ambulances are not turning up. As you said earlier, the Army is having to come in. That can't be because of extra money going in. It's because there's less money going in.
Lord Foulkes, I have the numbers here, and these are in 2020, 2021 prices. So they're adjusted for inflation, they're real terms. In 2010-11, the NHS budget was £126.4 billion a year. Now, in 2021-22, excluding COVID funding, it's £159 billion a year. Now, this is adjusted for inflation, an almost £25 billion increase across the course of that decade.
No, you're wrong. If you were right, why are there fewer doctors? Why are there fewer nurses? Why are we in a crisis? Of course there's a crisis.
But
everyone
there
knows.
aren't fewer nurses and fewer doctors, are there, Lord?
There are.
I think we're just going to come. We're just talking cross purposes here, because of course there are more doctors. I think one of the reasons why there's more pressure on these doctors is that the number of people in the country, the number of patients has increased, the cost of operations has increased, and indeed the cost of new medicines and new discoveries has driven up the demand within the NHS. Now, this is one of the big problems, I think, when we come to funding the NHS in the way that we do, which is, of course, just and right and equitable. But it does have some drawbacks, and those drawbacks include the infinite demand there are for services. There are some drugs that sadly are excluded from being on the NHS by NICE, that committee that decides what the NHS can provide, because ultimately the demand will always be infinite, will it not?
No, it certainly won't be infinite. How could it be infinite? It's increasing, certainly, because there are more older people like me requiring NHS treatment. But nothing could be infinite, certainly not as far as this is concerned. But of course, I think that there's a deliberate strategy by the Tories to cut the expenditure on the NHS, to keep it under control, because they want to move more and more people into the private sector. The private sector has increased and developed under this Conservative government, and that is a deliberate strategy that they're doing. They're not really so enthusiastic about the NHS. They don't use the NHS themselves.
Can you help me out? Lord Foulkes, can you help me out here? Which of these two numbers is bigger? 159 or 126?
Well, I think even you could work that out, couldn't you?
What
You don't
those
need me
numbers
to tell you
refer to,
that.
of course, is the number of billions of pounds that are being spent on the NHS. 159 billion now, 126 billion a decade ago, and those are in today's prices, adjusted
No, no,
for inflation. It's clearly a fantasy that you're saying the NHS is trying to be starved, is it not?
No, it's not at all. There have been increases, but nowhere near the increases that there were under the Labour
so
government.
you've changed your position. There haven't now been cutbacks.
No.
It's just the increases have not been as large as you'd like.
Not as large as is needed to maintain the services, to provide the services that are needed. I mean, you started off by saying that cancer treatment is not going to be managed to be provided up until 2032, the waiting list. You said that. You said that ambulances are, the army is having to come in.
Yeah.
You can see, Tom, exactly what's happening on the ground. And that's because there isn't enough money being put in. And there's not enough money being put in. And because there is a desire to see the private sector doing more and more in the NHS.
But Lord Foulkes, as a
absolutely.
proportion of its economy, Australia spends less on healthcare than the United Kingdom does. Yet it has better outcomes. Is it not the time that we can sometimes see that the way in which things are run can actually help deliver better services, and the conversation isn't always to do with how much money is put in?
I think it's interesting to compare it with another country like the United States. The United States has a poorer health service.
It does. I agree with you there. They spend more. They have worse outcomes in many cases. But why don't
and they spend more money on it?
Why don't we stop pretending there are only two systems in this world, the UK and the US? Why not look to Germany, to France, to Switzerland, to Australia?
Yes, I do.
These systems,
absolutely.
All these systems have a more pluralistic way of running their healthcare systems.
No, I think you're right. I think we need to look at other European countries in particular, and I would certainly do that. But we do have a basically fundamentally good structure. I think there's something needs to be done in relation to the amount of money that's spent in administration, and have more of it spent in the front line on doctors and nurses and other health professionals. But we do have basically a good health.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you there because we don't have very long. We don't have very long left in the programme, but we are delighted to have Paul Bristow back. We lost connection there for a second, but Paul is back here. And just in a very quick answer, Paul, what needs to be done to clear this backlog that has grown over the course of the pandemic?
Well, thanks, Tom, and sorry for the poor connection. But I think there are three fundamental things that we might want to have a think about. The first is around professional protectionism. We really need to free up consultants' time so they can power through some of that elective backlog. I don't understand why GPs, for example, are still prescribing the pill. I don't understand why we can't look at things such as nurse-led endoscopy. And I really think that we need to free up as much consultant time as possible. One real problem is that we've bought all this extra capacity from the independent sector, because you can't build new hospitals and train new consultants overnight. We have to use the independent sector. And for me, one of the real issues that I worry about, that there will be an ideological reluctance to use the independent
Paul, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We have very little left of the programme, but cut bureaucracy, a clear course there. Thank you for joining us both. We'll see you again next week, actually, from Monday on The Briefing. Thank you for joining us today.